slide to the overview. I'll just sort of go through the overview and then I'll pass on to Chris Wheeler for some of the details. Essentially, as people will no doubt be aware already, the crew members of Waverley's waste fleet, who are members of the GMB Union, in common with so many workers up and down the country facing the challenges of the cost of living crisis, have been balloted for strike action in pursuit of their pay claim. The union members have voted for that strike action and in the manner required by law have notified their employer of the intention to strike, and their employer being Biffa, who are contracted by us for the delivery of waste services. So the strike is scheduled to commence this Thursday and is currently scheduled to last around 3 weeks, but as it makes clear on that slide, under the terms of the vote, it could be longer, it could be shorter, or of course in the context of ongoing negotiations, it may not happen at all. So what I would want to emphasize at this point is that this is not a dispute involving Waverley Borough Council. Waverley Borough Council is not in dispute. It is merely the local authority that contracts with that contracts its waste services from an entirely separate public company, Biffa, but as the Borough Council with responsibility for waste services, clearly we are in the process of working round the clock currently, and our officers have been working round the clock in order to ensure that any disruption to the services that are provided for residents of Waverley is as minimal as possible, and that we do everything we can to support our residents of Waverley in the face of what is a difficult situation that is not of our making. And I'll now pass over to Chris Wheeler, who's been heading up the response and the dialogue and the negotiations with Biffa.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Can we have the next slide, please? So clearly been working for some time trying to sort of manage the situation. And we've developed some key strategies around that. The first one is clearly we want to minimise the impact of the strike. And we also recognise that we'd like to see a partial service at least, as some people will want to continue working. And what we want to do is maximise the impact of those collections as far as possible. We also want to ensure that if there is a disruption to the service, we recover that service as quickly as possible. So we've been doing quite a lot of planning work around that. The key piece of work we've been doing is around communications, and that's about keeping councillors and the public well informed, and that we're well prepared to ramp up that communication if and when strike action does occur. We've also been working on the contract legal matters to develop an appropriate strategy to engage with Biffa positively. In terms of our priorities for collection, there are some services, some parts of the service that are more vulnerable than others. Clinical waste services, for example, are critically important to very vulnerable people in our community, so they are going to have an absolute priority. Following that, then the core refuse, residual waste and food waste are then really, really important. I think then we look at recycling services where that is dry material, usually not very offensive, and it can actually stay in bins for a little bit longer or in bags. And then garden waste is obviously a non-statutory service and will be sort of like towards the bottom end of the priorities. Clearly, we want to be collecting refuse and food waste before we collect garden waste, if that comes to it. In terms of street cleaning, that's another part of the service that has potential to be affected. And again, we've set a clear priority with our contractor. The first one being that the duty to keep our roads clear and safe is, in terms of litter and detritus, is really important. So that's there first. Then we want to make sure the town centres are looked after, and then the litter bins from there. Next slide, please. So we have taken a great deal of legal advice and acted upon that regarding the contract. We come to the view that termination of the contract is really unrealistic for a number of reasons, but that we want to maintain services and recover those services quickly in the event of action. We are working on a contract variation to reflect that legal advice. In terms of the financials, there's some key principles at play here, and the primary one is that there should be no gain to Biffa from any savings from salaries from striking staff, and there should be no cost to the council. And we're agreeing an open book analysis plus audit as required to ensure that that occurs. Next slide, please. Moving on to communication and operational issues. The communication principles are very clear for us, is that this is industrial relations are a matter for Biffa and the GMB, but our focus, our external focus is really on advice to residents. So we've got lots of frequently asked questions on the website and ways to contact us for residents. All of the council's channels are ready and are already in use. We will, if strike action does go ahead, we will be suspending the misbin collection service so we can maximise the number of collections we can carry out, but we will maintain the customer helpline going forward. In terms of operational issues, the services will change daily as staffing levels are known. So we won't know each day exactly how many staff are going to be out and what services they'll be doing, but we'll be updating our information as soon as we have that information from our contractor and getting that information out to the public as quickly as we can. As I said, the focus will be on residual and food waste collection with other services as available. We are likely to see some longer days for those staff who are willing to work as they look to maximise those collections. So I'd summarise by saying that we're in a very fluid situation. We do have some reasons for optimism. There are ongoing negotiations, and we're hopeful that that will lead to an agreement. And if that happens, then we're business as usual. But we would be wrong to do anything other than plan on the basis of a strike, and that strike could be quite impactful. We are as ready as we can be, but we have to wait and see. If I go to the last slide. So this is, planning to distribute this slide to members. So this will be a useful point where people can check on the frequently asked questions, and also a handy reminder for the environmental services customer service contact number. I shall pass back to the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Steve, for going through that. I imagine there might be a number of questions, and so if there's any hands in the room, Councillor Costa to start with. And Councillor Munro.
Just two quick questions, if I can, please, Chair. The first one, I'd just be interested to know, although this is about Waverley, I'm interested to know how far Biffa have other contracts of this kind that are likely to lead to issues in other parts of the country. I mean, I just think that will impact the profile. We must focus on Waverley, but I think the context is important. So if anyone has any information on that, I'd be grateful to have it. The other question I wanted to ask is about what our priorities are going to be if we only have a partial service. I get road safety. I understand the thing about litter bins, but I'm not quite sure about the thing around town centres. In particular, I'm not sure what it's meant to include. So, for example, if I take my own communities across the Godalming area, well, Godalming High Street, I guess, is going to be regarded as a town centre. But what about Farncombe? There are lots of retail and built up small pockets of areas across our communities, which would seem to me to have the same issues as some of our main town centres. I guess you might also get some kickback from the rural areas if this is seen as any more than a focus on some of those commercial and retail areas, and that in some way those in more urban areas have a priority over those in more rural areas. So some clarification on that I will be grateful for.
So Chris, and just in terms of from my perspective, the priority areas are the areas with the most need and the most volume of actual waste, which is one of the reasons why the town centres are immediately identified. But I completely take your point. When we look at, say, Farncombe, or we look at, say, Milford, for example, where you've clearly got a retail area, have we got any clarity we can give to that, Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think in terms of street cleaning design, we always focus on the level of footfall, because litter comes from people and not elsewhere. So we'd actually look to focus the resources that are available on the areas of high demand. So that would include town centres, it would include shop fronts and the litter bins in and around those areas. So, but it would also be very dependent on who turns up. So there would be a priority order in there, but it would include not just the town centres, but also those shop fronts as well, because they're important. So.
It's probably just worth me saying that almost all of these things are caveated with how many people and which types of staff turn up as to how far we can cover additional priorities. I think Councillor Cossa. Councillor Munro is next, followed by Councillors Reid and then Gale.
Could I have an answer to my first question? Sorry.
My apologies. Sorry, no, sorry, Steve. Councillor Cossa's first question. Can you just repeat?
Just interested to know whether Biffa is going to be in dispute with a lot of other councils and things as well, when this is going to have a higher profile than just Waverley.
Yeah, so the GMB has been having a number of disputes around the country, and some have been resolved quite quickly, and some have taken some time. We do know that just within the Surrey context, there was a dispute between Biffa and the GMB in Tandridge, and that was resolved as well in recent months. So there are pressures on people all over the country, and the GMB are acting on behalf of their members to try and improve their terms and conditions, which is understandable in some circumstances.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Did you want to just jump in for a second?
Yeah, it was just very quickly to add to the response to Councillor Cossa's question regarding town centre prioritisation, and the focus there is clearly on footfall, but clearly going forward, dependent on how long this particular action lasts, obviously that will be constantly under review, because clearly the priority is to address the greatest need first, and prioritise, where there is detritus, where there are large numbers of people, and that clearly would be the priority. So, taking the specifics of Farncombe, for example, that Councillor Cossa raised, clearly Farncombe is a populous area, and it would be an area that we would be looking very closely at in terms of the day-to-day management of the work on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, Steve. Councillor Munro.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Three things. I represent a highly rural area, but I do accept the logic is to concentrate on town centres. I don't dispute that. And thank you for reassurance that we won't be forgotten completely. But there will be hard choices if there's a major strike here. I've just had a look at the website. I think you probably have plans for improving it, but it would be nice to see the strike absolutely on the front page without having to scroll down, and it's slightly out of date, but hopefully that's in hand, because it'll probably get a lot of traffic. And the last question I have, I fear there is a danger of extra fly tipping as residents lose patience. Are we talking to the police, other authorities, bung it on the website to try and dissuade people and wish people luck in dissuading? Those are my three.
Thank you, Councillor Munro. I can take all three of those. We certainly won't forget your ward, because it includes Frensham Ponds, so we'd never, ever, ever forget Frensham Ponds under any circumstances, particularly when it comes to litter. So that reassurance certainly given. In terms of comms, we'll update the web page, the main home page, to put a link, as we often do for incidents and emergencies. And certainly the web page is going to be updated to include the most recent information that we have as and when the strike actually starts, if it starts. And in terms of the last question, which I've managed to forget, fly tipping. I've asked for comms to be put out at various stages during the strike for however long it lasts, to remind people of the offence that fly tipping is, both from a legal perspective and also from a moral one. And also we have been working with the police and other authorities to increase any pressure we can bring to bear on fly tipping, because it's something that annoys a lot of us most of the time without a strike, let alone with. Just to confirm, Chris, as well, Surrey County Council have also offered to increase their opening hours and or staff resources at the major CRCs.
Yep, that's correct. They have offered some assistance if and when needed.
Councillor Reid is next.
Thank you, Leader, and good evening, everyone. Basically, I wanted to say that, and thank you, Chris, for doing your presentation and for Councillor Williams' explanations. I live in a rural part of Cranley, and we have very small, narrow byways up which, especially at the end of the My Lane, the small trucks come up. And I was just wondering how much priority we would be given in that case. You know, but we are in the whole of Waverley, but especially in Cranley East, not only rural, but we have more elderly people. So I know and I understand that the vulnerable will have priority. So, but could you say something about, you know, the very narrow access areas, please, because we mustn't forget them. Thank you.
After you, Chris, on this one, but I will add something afterwards.
Thank you, Leader. Yes, thank you, Councillor Reid. I think just going back to the presentation, we're very clear that we're going to focus on refuse and food waste across the borough. So, but it is very dependent on staff availability. That those vehicles will be generally managed by crews who are very knowledgeable, who come there very often. If they're on strike, then it will affect the quality of the service, and we'll look to recover that service as quickly as possible. But we're not actually prioritising different levels of refuse and food waste for different areas. We're going to try and get everything we can as quickly as we can, and if we can't, recover it as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Chris. And just to add, one of the things that I'm sure all of us as councillors have noticed in the past is that the crews that are experienced in dealing with a particular area start to know the bits that are narrow and the bits that are difficult and the bits that they actually need to remember. So I think one of the things, just to manage expectations, is that if we have crews that do not know the area as well, or the specific bit they're being asked to do, there is probably a higher possibility of things being missed anyway, just for that regular reason. Okay, I've got Councillor Gale, followed by Councillor Hegan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just three quick questions, please. Food waste is probably going to be one of the most difficult things for people, especially where I am, because of foxes and things like that, if it accumulates. Is there any possibility that Surrey could open up a food waste bin or something at the CRCs? That would actually help. The next question is garden waste. People out here, obviously lots of garden waste, and they're asking, would there be any refunds for non-collection? And the last question is, when the system does come back online, will the Biffa chaps take extra waste away? Can we put it in boxes, bags and things like that to be taken away? Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Yes, so in terms of food waste, the tips, that's something we can specifically ask Surrey, but at the moment we haven't determined what we need yet, but I'll certainly make sure that that's flagged to Surrey as a question and a possibility. In terms of refunds for garden waste, we don't yet know what the impacts are, so it's impossible to say what response we're going to have yet. I think we have to see what the impacts are and then make a decision as to what's the best way of managing that going forward. So we'll have to wait to see on that one and come back to you. In terms of extra waste, yes, in the event of a strike, we are expecting full recovery. Again, one of the questions earlier was about fly tips. Well, actually, if we're very clear that we will come back and we will clear extra, hopefully that will prevent some of those fly tipping issues as well.
Thank you, Maxine. Councillor Hegan. Councillor Hegan, I think you're next, if you can hear me.
Oh, yes, thank you, Leader. I'm being told my internet connection's unstable, so hopefully you don't lose me. I'm a bit concerned when we talk about the priority on street cleaning being on safety. To me, one of the biggest safety issues at the moment is the amount of leaf debris that is going to be on the roads, and that is going to be more the rural areas, but it will affect pavements and the town centres. I mean, I would like to flag that I would want to hear that that is going to be a priority over and above what I'd call general litter that might not have the same safety connotations. So that's the first point. And the second point is I'd just like a bit more clarification about the contract negotiations that are ongoing, the changes that are hoped for and what they will achieve for us. So those are my two questions.
Chris / probably Annie as well, I imagine, on the contract side.
Yeah, in terms of road safety and street cleaning, one of the key things that happens if we don't sort of sweep and manage the roads is that you get a build of leaf fall and silt into areas, and that can lead to flooding. So clearly that's one of the main focuses. But again, it does depend on who's on strike and what's available in terms of skills to actually continue with that work. So, but what we'd want to do is focus on that road safety first, which I think you're right is leaf fall and associated detritus that can lead to further issues is clearly up there in terms of priorities.
Can I just flag on that one before I come to Annie that particularly those of you that are double or triple hatters, that if your parishes are flagging areas that are genuinely a hazard, a risk, that they should try and flag them up to Waverley as soon as possible so that we can understand the areas that are a problem, particularly in the more rural areas where they might otherwise get missed. Annie.
Good evening, everyone. Councillor Hegan, thanks for the question. The contract negotiations are a feature of how we are managing the potential dispute. As Councillor Follows has already said, this is a dispute between the GMB and Biffa rather than Waverley, and our relationship is contractual with Biffa. So in terms of ensuring that the council gets value for money, what we have looked at doing, there are two routes to look at the contract, and that is either to start serving, if you like, notices on the contractor saying they failed to deliver the contract and then land up in long-term complex negotiations, or the route that we have chosen is to have an open book policy where we will review with them who came into work, what costs were saved by them, and simply claim that money back or not pay it to them in the first place when it comes to the monthly bill. So the variation is a contractual notice that we serve on them saying we're not actually varying the contract, we are varying how we collect money from them and how we pay them in relation to the strike. And we think that's a much better, a much shorter way of recovering and providing value for money for the public by having this open book approach. So it's not actually altering the terms of the contract other than the payments and making sure that we don't pay for services that we haven't actually had from them during this dispute. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. So are Biffa happy with that concept? Have they agreed it in principle?
They've agreed it in principle, and the other thing that they asked for, they initially asked for it to be a relief event, which is we've refused and said the only relief is from termination of the contract for failure to deliver it. And there was not a difficult disagreement over it. It was more, they'll give it a try and we're going to say no. So they are relatively happy, and that feels fair, and it also feels like we have a relationship with them to continue delivering the best service possible during a very difficult time for them and for us.
And just for my own information and probably for others as well, they're what, about 3 years into a 7-year contract? Is that about right?
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. I've next got Councillor Peter Marriott.
Thank you, Leader. I just wonder is it possible to give residents some notification of when their bins might be collected or not? And what would be the principle if it's not collected, let's say in a partial collection, will they be then delayed to the fortnight later before they might be collected again?
To preempt one thing, some of it's going to depend on who shows up for work. But Chris.
Yeah, I'd say that the situation is extremely fluid. You know, it depends on who turns up to work and then how long the strike goes on for. So if it lasts one day and they come to an agreement, then we'll pretty much recover on Saturday. If it lasts for a longer time, then it becomes very difficult to recover, and then you are looking at suspension until the next collection round. So it very much depends on what actually happens through the rest of this week and who turns out on Thursday.
And Peter, we'll be using the website as well as emailing all members as frequently as we can to update them on what advice they can give to residents as to how to manage the way through this. We can only do this when we know what resources we're dealing with when and if it starts. So it's a case of all members keeping an eye out for communications from Chris and Annie over the course of the next couple of weeks. Councillor Seaborn is the last hand I've got up.
Thank you, Leader, and thanks very much for facilitating this really useful session. It's much appreciated. Can I address a question to Chris? Can he comment on the distribution of unionisation amongst the Biffa crews? Is it random, in which case we might possibly expect around 50% of crews to be able to function, or at least 50% of the total operation to function? Or is there any element of systemization where perhaps, you know, drivers are more unionized than others, in which case the impact might be significantly greater? Thanks very much.
That one I will have to ask you to do, Chris.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you, Councillor Seaborn. I think union membership is an individual matter for each individual, and they don't have to declare that to their employer. So we don't actually have an exact picture of who is within the union, and equally we're not their employers either, so we wouldn't know that in the first place. We also don't know how that. Of those who have, because GMB have voted to strike, it doesn't mean that all of their members will strike, though obviously there'll be a lot of pressure on that to be a full turnout if they do want to turn out and strike. We also know that elsewhere, when there has been strike action, it has impacted on other members of staff. Sickness has increased, for example, rather than cross a picket line, people have become unwell, for example. How unwell they are, we obviously don't know. I don't want to speculate as to whether we will see a half service or a three-quarter service or a quarter service. I don't want to raise any expectations and then come to you and say, actually, for these reasons, a number of other people didn't turn up. It is, as I said, a very fluid situation. We won't know until Thursday morning, and when we know on Thursday morning, we will be updating all councillors, all residents, as quickly as we possibly can through our communication channels.
Thank you, Chris. Steve?
Yes, just really, I think these have been very, very helpful questions, and particularly, I mean, the last question is one that kind of reflects, I think, a frustration that a lot of us feel, that we actually don't know how this is actually going to impact us in the first instance. And obviously, as I think we've said this evening, as times goes on through this dispute, then clearly issues will emerge, concerns will arise. And so I would just urge, in the event of this dispute continuing, you know, beyond this week and into next week and beyond, that councillors keep us appraised of the issues that are actually affecting your local areas, your local wards, and also that parish and town councils, again, raise any specific concerns that they've got, so that we can potentially nip any problems in the bud and serve the residents as best we possibly can in difficult circumstances.